A good way to figure out what tools an inker is working with is to look at the frames of their comic. This is Walt Kelly's Pogo, and you can see the fluid lines of these frames suggest Mr. Kelly worked with a thin, round brush. A calligraphy nib, like Watterson used, would have a slightly more rigid look, and a technical drawing pen wouldn't fluctuate in line weight. Walt Kelly's Pogo comics ran in newspapers from about 1949 to 1975, and he certainly had an impact on countless upcoming comic artists, illustrators, and animators. And it wouldn't surprise you probably to find out that he even got his start working at the Walt Disney Studios. Despite his decades of amazing comic work and creating hundreds of adorable characters, Walt Kelly's most important legacy is the impression he left on a young cartoonist named Jeff Smith. Jeff Smith grew up to create the comic book Bone. Like Kelly, Jeff Smith left animation to pursue his storytelling through independent comics, and he single-handedly invented the genre of middle-grade fantasy graphic novels. If you haven't read Bone, what are you waiting for? It's basically the Lord of the Rings of graphic novels for kids. But hey, I grew up with Bone, so maybe I'm a little biased. Okay, back to the lesson. It's obvious that the DNA of Walt Kelly's inking style runs through Jeff Smith's art. Like Watterson, Smith used inking to enhance his narratives. The Bone cousins in the story are inked with clean, long, animation-style brushstrokes. The characters look like they walked out of a cartoon into the world of this story. And therefore, by contrast, the environment of the graphic novel series, the human characters, the other monsters, and the main villains all feel more realistic in their ink textures. There's more of a physicality to them. Mr. Smith uses his inking style to show the stakes of the story. The threat of death, the emotionality of the narrative, hits the human characters a lot harder than the Bone cousins. Now, the stakes in Bone aren't quite as high as they are in a comic like Akira, the post-apocalyptic manga from the 1980s, written and illustrated by Katsushiro Otomo. Otomo's inking style heightens the realism to a more mature level. On first glance, you can tell this is not necessarily a comic for kids. We can see textures in the ink, the grime of the half-destroyed world. We can see blood and sweat. The inking style in Akira and a lot of genre manga that followed it is very dynamic, which calls for a wider range of tools. You've got the weighty fluidity of the brush in the more organic shapes, like the characters' bodies. But manga artists really love to indulge in the environment, so there's a lot of technical drawing pens at use, which is a perfect tool for conveying straight lines that appear in things like this grid mounted in the ceiling. Also, the dynamic feel of manga is conveyed through lots of motion lines, really densely packed together. Technical pens are perfect for action scenes like this. Ink is relied on to represent all kinds of materials and textures. Knowing how to convey texture is a crucial visual storytelling technique for the comic artist. Think about what this drawing is telling us about these two characters just by the way the two hands are being inked. Linda Barry's comics have a sensibility all their own. She's been publishing collections of offbeat stories about dating, adulthood, being an artist, and life in general since the late 1970s. This comic is from a collection of work from 1981. Her work is probably best described as journalistic investigations of human behavior. Without any consistency of character or story, Barry's comics reflect her personality and point of view at a very basic, energetic level. Her inks are playful and abstract and graphical, It seems like she's working with a single-size technical pen and simply going back over lines to make them thicker. And it's intentional that the energy of her inking feels almost rushed, like she just sat down on a park bench and whipped out this comic in a couple minutes. They're intended to feel like the ideas are flowing quickly, as fast as she can think of them. But if you look closer, she's still putting an amazing amount of time and effort into establishing distinct aspects of this world. Look at the patterns and textures on every surface and object in her panel. The inking style moves quick, but you can also linger and look at the details of her world building. I grew up to love and admire all of Miss Berry's work as an artist and even more as a teacher. But I gotta admit, when I first encountered her inking style, when I was around 15 years old, it was kind of a turnoff. Remember, I had been spending my youth looking at Bone comic books and obsessively reading them, waiting for the next issue to come out. So, in my mind, I expected comics to feel clean and professional. Linda Berry's work had ink smudges all over it, and her lettering was wildly inconsistent. It made it even hard to read. You had to wonder if she wanted you to read it in the first place. And that's not a judgment on her style or approach. All I'm trying to point out here is our reaction to ink and technique is very emotional, and we expect certain things based on our experience. There's no right or wrong way to ink a comic, but I do think it's important to understand who your style appeals to. Our first reaction to seeing a comic comes from the way it looks, and the first thing we see is the ink. Stylistic choices affect your storytelling in more ways than you think. Now, if you want to learn more about inking style, specifically in book illustration, I've got a whole class dedicated to the topic. Go check that out later, but for now we're going to move on. So at this point, we've discussed the flow of comic panels and how to ink them. Next, we'll talk about the kinds of stories comics can tell.